Belinda is going to start.
Well, good afternoon. Let me extend a hearty welcome to all of you around the country who are joining us today for this very exciting webinar. I want to start with a quote in this welcome from Lance in 2015 because I think it really sets the context. And the quote is this: "How we teach must reflect how our students learn. It must also reflect the world they will emerge into. This is a world that is rapidly changing, connected, adapted, and evolving. Our style and approach to teaching must emphasize the learning in the 21st century." The Every Student Succeeds Act, affectionately referred to as ESSA, as we all know, presents various opportunities for state education agencies to rethink how they best serve all, and the operative word there is all students. According to the Chief Council of State School Officers, with more decision making now in the hands of state leaders, this is but the perfect time to identify innovative solutions to drive reform relevant to students from diverse backgrounds as ESSA implementation occurs. The Central and South Central Comprehensive Centers have partnered with the Intercultural Development Research Association, IDRA, Equity Assistance Center, the South and Midwest and Plains Equity Assistance Centers, in an initiative we call Moving Towards a Culturally Responsive Pedagogy, a call to action to offer SEA, state education agencies, a framework that supports districts and schools in transforming and implementing approaches to teaching that ensures academic achievement for all students. The initiative that is being launched today includes two webinars with an online follow-up. Today, we are having our first webinar with Paula Martin Johnson, Associate Director of IDRA, presenting Culturally Responsive Pedagogy, an effective tool in systemic school transformation under ESSA. And so with that as context, please join me in welcoming Paula, and let's roll up our sleeves for an amazing and engaging webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Belinda. We really appreciate welcoming, and I think that you have set the stage perfectly. Just before we turn this to Paula, want to go through some housekeeping issues. You are invited to make your comments and questions. To do that, you can either click on the emoji in the upper part of the line that is below the attendees list, and then you can click where you can raise your hands to call the attention of the speaker. Otherwise, you can also use the chat section, which is already there, and use your keyboard. This webinar also includes polls in this presentation. So we thank you in advance your participation, and please, once you vote, don't forget to click the Send Vote button. As Belinda said, our future speaker is Ms. Paula Martin. She is the Associate Director of Intercultural Research Association Equity Assistance Center. Has more than 20 years of experience developing educational programs and integrating the use of instructional technology in the classroom. Ms. Johnson holds a bachelor's degree in mathematics, a master's degree in education and instructional technology, and is currently a doctoral candidate in the interdisciplinary learning and teaching program at the University of Texas in San Antonio. Her research focus includes curriculum and instruction related to females and minorities in math and science, gender equity in education, and mathematics learner identity. Ms. Johnson currently leads the IDRA Equity Assistance Center Region 2 Technical Assistance and Professional Development pertaining to inclusion and diversity, implicit bias, cultural competency, and disproportional disciplinary action against students of color. She has led different programs focusing preparing elementary, middle, and high school teachers to serve English language learners and diverse student population. And of course, I can go on to continue sharing all the highlights of her impressive resume. But I don't want to take more of her time. So without further ado, I am going to hand the floor over to Ms. Johnson. Paula, this is all yours.
Thank you so much, Rosie. And Ms. Belinda, this is a wonderful opportunity for the IDRA EAC South, as well as all of the Equity Assistance Centers and the Comprehensive Centers. This venture is almost a momentous occasion for Comp Centers and EACs to come together to work with SEAs and LEAs and maybe a couple people in between. I have a few districts that are online that might even have some legal counsel. So this is a great time for us to begin a conversation that crosses multiple platforms. And so, as Rosie said, and as Belinda also iterated, that we want to look at ESSA through a culturally relevant and responsive pedagogical lens as an effective tool in systemic school transformation. The conversations surrounding the foundation of this venture, we talked about coming from a top-down and from a bottom-up systemic approach and how they look different. I have a history of being a secondary math teacher, and so my original viewpoint of school transformation was very different than it is now, me working for an educational nonprofit focused on equity for diverse learners and what that means to different people. And so I hope that you get, my goal always for my professional development is to get at least one aha moment and one takeaway for every participant. So we have a little over an hour of content to get through with your interaction and your involvement, and so we can begin. I wanted to begin today's conversation discussing what guides the work of the Intercultural Development Research Association, or IDRA, or IDRA, as many people call us different things. But we base our work on what we call the Quality Schools Action Framework. And the QSAF basically displays the different areas that all the different stakeholders in education, where they enter or exit quality schools. And so you have your accountable leadership at the state level, the district level, the campus level, the classroom level. And in that first column, if you will, we talk about engaged citizenry and enlightened public policy. So IDRA considers ourselves border crossers in research, policy, and practice based on actionable knowledge. So we put forth a lot of data. We just published a nutrition study to make sure that we are, using the correct data to make these informed decisions regarding our research, policy, and practice. And in the next column, you would have change strategies. And most of the work that I do is in the school capacity building. I work mainly in schools and school districts, but we also have to have coalitions and then community engagement and capacity building. And we have several programs that we use, models and framework that we use to help that change occur. And then in the next two columns, we talk about the school system fundamentals, the things that we cannot do without, and that one of them is governance and leadership, and the other is fair funding, fair and equitable funding, because those things have to be secured in order to provide the resources for the work that we need to do. And that fourth column is school system indicators, and where we focus our change is, again, parent and involvement and community engagement. We talk about student engagement, authentic student engagement, which we will talk about today. Teaching quality, effective teaching workforce. It's important that we have effective teachers that can communicate educational directives and skills, but also meet the needs of the whole child. And then lastly, we talk about curriculum quality and access, and that's definitely something that we will discuss today about appropriate materials for culturally responsive instructional practices. And the final is, what outcomes are we seeking? And again, ESSA, I think we were ahead of the game, and that if ESSA is true to its word, these are the outcomes that we want to see. We want school holding power. We want attrition rates to go down. We want retention rates to go down. We want graduation rates to go up. We'd like to see more students successfully enter college and career. So, you know, people say that this is what we want for all children, but I don't think that everyone really understands what it means when it doesn't happen. So these outcomes are what we're seeking to attain. And when we talk about culturally responsive pedagogy and instructional practices, our work is based on equitable educational opportunities for all students, inclusive of race, religion, gender, national origin, language that they speak, family income, all of those sometimes barriers, but demographics about students that can impede and sometimes prohibit their quality or access to quality education. And so we do have Dr. Bradley Scott in the 90s, I believe 1999, developed for IDRA 6 goals of educational equity and school reform. We are in the business of educational policy that produces results for all students. And so these 6 goals, beginning at the top with student achievement and outcomes, there's a whole rubric that allows districts to look at, are we doing, or how good of a job are we doing as far as student achievement is concerned and comes for student success? What does it look like, and how do we rate, and where do we need to be focusing our attention? When we talk about access and inclusion, you can't have students enrolled in AP honors courses if there are no AP honors courses to offer at a school, where, say, in another city or across town or even in the same district, you may have 20 AP or honors classes being offered to students. And so we want to talk about equitable access and inclusion to advanced mathematics and to specialized programs, whatever we need for quality instruction for our students. And treatment, and that speaks volumes, treatment of families, treatment of students, reducing or eliminating disproportional practices in the treatment of students of different racial backgrounds or religious backgrounds or gender or language, national origin, what have you. But we want fair and equitable treatment of all students because they are valuable. We believe in an asset-based mentality, not deficit speech and rhetoric around students. And then the last 3 go back to our inputs and outputs. So the opportunity to learn. Just because you offer particular classes, the opportunity to learn has to also, it speaks to quality teaching practices and effective teaching practices. And so not only do we want students, more diverse populations of students in those seats, we want teachers in front of them that are contributing to their learning experiences in a positive way. Resources distribution, I would say it goes without description, but we as an organization want to be sure or ensure, again, fair funding and equitable funding of states and districts so that resources are being distributed equitably among student populations. Give it be textbooks or technology, in either case, students need to be receiving the tools that they need for effective instruction and learning to occur. And the final piece is shared accountability. In this particular instance, we want to make sure that at every level, the people who are responsible for every by varied measures, and we'll talk about that again later on in the webinar. But shared accountability means that the student, the parent, the teacher, the administrators, the counselors, the support staff, the district leadership, the state leadership, the regional assistance centers, that everyone believes that they are accountable to every child. And so that's kind of the framework that we live in at IDRA and the EAC South. And so given that, now I can, with that background, I'll go into the actual objectives of the afternoon. And so there are three. The goal is that all participants would understand and strengthen our knowledge and understanding of culturally responsive pedagogy in an effort to support all students, inclusive. And some people say regardless of, but again, equity-based and asset-based would be inclusive of all students and their families. And looking at design, we want to identify strategies that will help in this situation, in this webinar, increase effectiveness of SEA support to LEAs who are then going to be going into schools to build inclusive school settings and environments. And then finally, how do we transform educational practice? We are going to explore systemic opportunities for building these equitable learning environments and what that might look like. I have some examples of activities are actually ongoing in a variety of ESSA plans and what opportunities there are for SEAs to work with their LEAs and regional districts to begin this transformation and live up to the goals of the Every Student Succeeds Act. And so we have our first question. So question number one. Who is more responsible for school quality? The federal government, the state government, or local school districts? Be sure to click Send Vote. And my apologies, I'm doing an SOS to my IT support. I thought you would be able to see the results. Give me one moment. There we go. With 38 people in the room, 75% have voted. Wow. have a question in the chat box that I would like for anyone who's willing to answer. Did anyone vote for all three? That all three are responsible for school quality? We're finished at 75% of the votes. Okay, so 61% of the people that are participating today believe that the local school district is the most responsible for school quality. And and John, I see your response. I didn't either. I just tested it out for the first time. But I think, you know, as I was doing this, and I wrote the question, but as I was doing it, I was like, well, you know, they really are all. And again, that's a different, thank you, Carol. That was, once I thought about the question, I realized, well, that's what today is all about and why we're having a second webinar on 5th of December to discuss more of the classroom up. The more responsible, I do believe the end game or the end of the line is the local school district. But even then, I should have added another one because there would be another two levels. There would be the school level and then the classroom level. And so then that would probably make it much more difficult for me to answer. And so, yes, I agree with everyone who's saying that the wording has more responsible. But I think that it depends on if the question were asked in a different way, the output is what they're more responsible for. The federal government and our state government are responsible for setting up the foundation for schools to be quality schools, which then puts the other part of the burden on, not burden, but the responsibility on local school districts, the campuses, and the actual classroom. And so I do thank you for your responses, and I think it's a difficult question. And it depends on who you're talking to. I have spent the last 2 days with a room full of philanthropists, like from the Coca-Cola Foundation, from the Ford Foundation, from the Schott Foundation, and these are all philanthropists and not necessarily educators, a lot of lawyers and policymakers. And so I think their answer might be a lot different. So I have a second question. Actually, I'm going to go to this question. Before we get into school climate and culture, do you believe that they are the same thing? I have heard some people use them interchangeably, school climate and school culture. And so if you would vote on your feelings about that, are they the same thing or no, are they different? I hope I'm pronouncing this name right. Saroja Warner, I believe I agree with you that there is a level of compliance in that. Oh, good, I did. There is definitely a level of compliance, and there's so much about enforcement versus implementation. So I think it's a slippery slope, I think now being away from the classroom, there's so many more pieces to the puzzle that I see and how the two come together. But I do believe that conversations like today are a great start. And as soon as the voting is finished, okay, so we can go back to the survey. 65% say no. And I looked up a variety of resources on this because of the way people do climate surveys and school cultural surveys, and they really are. So this is what I found, that the difference between climate and culture is, one, climate is the way we feel at school. So culturally responsive school environments ensure that the conditions for successful teaching and learning are in place. So again, that's kind of where I see, as someone said, compliance. I see that as kind of a state level and even local education agencies and district level responsibility to safeguard and ensure that all of the infrastructure is there. School culture, however, talks about how we do school. And culturally responsive school culture is demonstrated through the behaviors um, that are shaped in shared values and beliefs of the school administrators, the students, the parents. One of one of the leaders at Phi Delta Kappa, Kappan, says that you know that you have a positive school culture when you can pick any child from a school and ask them if there's a person that they can name at that school that knows them well and has their back. That if every child can say that, then you have a very positive and enriching and supportive school culture. School climate is, do they feel safe? Do they feel that their basic needs are being met? And so it's really interesting because for all my years in education, we took school climate surveys all the time. And what they really were asking, they should have been separated into climate and culture. And so that was really one kind of aha moment in looking at this work, because they're both necessary. They're definitely both necessary. But again, one is more systemic. Do we have the access to paper and supplies that we need? Are the students going to be fed? With schools in Detroit, and when your school has to close because there's mold on the walls, or the heater is not working and it's 20 degrees in the building, that is an infrastructure situation versus everything is perfect and in place and it could be a brand new school, but the school culture is not supportive nor conducive to student learning. So that's kind of how I see the two of those. But again, they're both very important. And so the definition, trying to define culturally responsive pedagogy is somewhat difficult, actually, because you're looking at different, I'll say, researchers and practitioners and theorists, because some people will say culturally relevant teaching, others will say culturally responsive pedagogy, some will say culturally responsive instruction or culturally relevant instruction. But when you look at all of those, you're looking at Geneva Gay and you're looking at Gloria Ladson-Billings, the work from really the 90s, and Tate. So a comprehensive and concise definition for this is that culturally responsive teaching will integrate the cultural knowledge, like funds of knowledge, prior experiences, and performance styles or learning styles of a diverse student population to make learning more appropriate and effective for them, that they can see themselves in the day-to-day of their schooling, and is teaching to and through the strengths of these students. That's not a direct quote, but that's kind of from Geneva Gay, that you're teaching to and through the strengths of students. I do a lot of English learner instruction strategies for like content teachers as a math educator. A lot of teachers that I came in contact with would kind of put off those supports towards English learner specialists, the ESL department, where I wanted to be able to support them in my classroom because math in itself I see as a second language. And most people hate math, so I wanted to do the most that I could for my students. And so taking their funds of knowledge as a math teacher, sometimes I would tend to think, oh, well, I have to teach them math. Regardless of the home language that was being spoken, the first language being spoken, I realized they understand their numbers. I just have to make it make sense for me. So if I were to disregard all the strengths that they bring to my classroom, then that would invalidate the knowledge that they are carrying with them. And so that's what culture responsive teaching is, that it takes into account our individual experiences and our field and the way we negotiate, even the way we negotiate understanding. Some people want to write every single thing down, and others want to talk about it, and others just sit back and think, and then they'll come up with something. But all of those different learning styles are what make us different and unique, and all of those things are valuable. And so culturally responsive teaching embraces those differences and takes them for what they are and finds ways to incorporate them in the classroom so that students feel validated and valued and see how the curriculum, whatever it is, how the curriculum speaks to their own existence. Um, it makes sense of the world for them in their individual and unique world, um, and how they can demonstrate their understanding of that. So now that we have a definition that we can work with, and there are a variety of definitions, but that's the one we're working with today. Seeing as I'm giving you this bright sky because I'm in Atlanta and we are, I'm feeling very positive today. I totally take other definitions, but that's the one that I think encapsulates a lot of what the research says about culture responsive pedagogies or teaching and instruction. So as practice, the goal of CRP is to create learning environments that will meet the needs of all students. When we talk about equitable, one of IDRA's mottos or hashtags is all means all. Every single child, inclusive of their ethnic background, their cultural background, their linguistic background, their sexual orientation, their religion, their gender, the whole child, and the child and their families. So we talk about community schools, and I know that we don't exactly have those in most places nowadays, but the school is a community school because the families are involved. The younger siblings or older siblings and the parents, the people who don't have children on the campus but are in the community, all of those things have to be taken into account. And so a culturally responsive school or learning environment takes all that a child is, all of their multiple identities, and embraces that in the schoolroom. Teacher, administrators, district level, all the way up to the state stakeholders that are a very important part of the educational process. The outputs of culture responsive pedagogy, research shows that culturally relevant practices in the classroom have a positive effect on that learning environment, that students feel you're basically building student leadership. Students learn how to value themselves and others and their differences, and then they incorporate that diversity in how they negotiate understanding and make meaning of the content that's being placed before them. It helps in is they find ways to engage the students authentically with the curriculum, but with each other. And we're going to talk a little bit about relationships in a moment. But it improves the quality of instruction because students are really, they talk to each other. That a lot of this is about substantive conversations and, you know, getting students to understand that they are part of the instructional process, that we're not just giving them this information, that they are, it's an interactive learning situation because teachers are learning from students at the same time. Even just asking how something is different, if whatever the concept is, if we're talking about in cooking, or I always default to mathematics, so forgive me in advance. It's not a test, but when we talk about fractions, there's so many different ways to talk about fractions, and one way that I use is recipes. And so I would talk about recipes, and I would ask different students how recipes are in their family. Are they written down? Do they use measuring cups? Would it be fractional, or is it just, you know, a pinch here, a pinch there, and who's the best cook? And even if it's not specific to talking about fractions, it engages them in the conversation. They have come to the table, so to speak, and they are contributing to a conversation that helps them own that learning. Oh, we talked about fractions today, and we were talking about recipes, and I told about, you know, this is them at home. I told my teacher about how you make pasta, and I mean, it's just, it makes it real. is a real conversation, whether you're talking about social studies or science or math or English or PE or music, giving students that voice to express themselves in the content or within the content using their personal stories is just that's what makes it so effective. And so again, you get that higher percentage of authentic engagement from students, and the engagement itself is truly deep. It is I think the word robust can be used and overused sometimes, but it is robust. And so sometimes it's very difficult to get the kids to stop talking, but it's something that excites them. And so it gives them a reason to want to come to school. I think all children value education if the education is valuable. So we have to increase our effectiveness, and this is just one of the ways to do that. And so speaking of our capacity to do that and be cultural creators, one thing that we're finding is that, of course, and this is not new, but our classrooms across the country are becoming more culturally diverse. However, our teaching force is predominantly white and female. Our student population is more culturally and linguistically diverse. And I have a data item to share that I found, but first I have a question. And this is a free-form answer or Q&A, and this is totally open, but what area of diversity presents the greatest challenge in your particular state or region? And again, in the Equity Assistance Centers, we deal specifically with race, religion, gender, and national origin. And there are a lot of paths that lead away from that. One could be school discipline, one is absenteeism, one is family engagement, one is the hiring and retention of a diverse teacher faculty. If it's a rural area, how do you recruit effective quality teachers from the city, quote unquote? So I'm asking, what are the challenges that are related to diverse student populations that you are seeing in your state or region or district, depending on your level of entry in education? And I will wait for Michelle to put up the results. And if you did not notice, there will be a link. Michelle has shared the link that the presentation will be housed in our community of practice to continue the conversation after the recording is finished and she's able to upload it. Have all the votes been cast? Results? Do we have a magic wand? Oh, I can't see the results. Okay, I'm going to put Michelle on that one, and we will move forward. I need to see what the answers are. Okay.
Hello, Paula.
Yes, ma'am.
Hey, as far as the survey results, because it's an open-ended question, it doesn't
They
really
won't
give
list
it
them.
to you the same way.
Okay, that's fine. The open-ended, I'm thinking that after we finish, we'll be able to see them and I can post them on the community of practice, or Michelle can. But I asked the question
Absolutely.
because we do, as EACs, we do a contextual needs analysis when we talk to a school district. And so not every school district obviously is made up of the same student populations. And where one school district has, like right now, we've reached out to Florida, it's in our region. And because of the hurricanes in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, those students are moving mainland. And so you have school districts who have maybe not ever had a student who, and we don't have our numbers yet, but there's thousands of kids, obviously, thousands of school district children who, some of them may be English learners. Well, we want to be proactive, and if those school districts are not equipped with if they have not built capacity around English learner instruction, then we want to go build that professional development and technical assistance so that they are capable of delivering instruction without interrupting any further those students' lives. So that might be the case there, whereas in some districts that I work with, they're under desegregation orders and have a consent decree in place, and so we do technical assistance in the area of more than, in a lot of them, it's disproportional school discipline practices. So every school district may have a bit of all of these different indicators, but some are going to be higher in one area than the other. And so I like to find out across the country, like, what are people finding to be the most challenging for them. But all of it comes down to, in a lot of conversations that we have, a lot of it comes down to misunderstandings in some cases, or not being knowledgeable enough about the students that we serve. And so this little graphic, now this is back to 2014, and I believe the number is not much, it's not going to change. It's still on the same track from the National Center for Educational Statistics, that, as I said, the majority of public school educators are white and female, and as of 2014, white. I believe right now that number is closer to 80%. But if you look at those numbers, I mean, that's still a very disproportionate number of people in the teaching workforce versus the number of public school students that we are serving. We are now at a place where it's about 51% minority, minority by 2025. So when we talk about culturally relevant teaching practices, and the question came up today, as a matter of fact, that, you know, we have teachers and we want to build their efficacy. You cannot make 83% of your teaching population who are white into a minority. So what do? One is we want to recruit more people of color into the teaching field, but we already have good teachers in the teaching field, but there is definitely a racial, ethnic, cultural mismatch that causes some of the difficulties that we see in the educational process. And so when we talk about culture between teachers and students, culture is the values, behaviors, beliefs, and attitudes held by a particular person. And when I say culture, and when researchers actually say culture, we are mostly all multicultural. Yes, I am a Black woman, but I am from southern San Diego, and I now reside in Texas, and I'm a mom, and I am a Christian, and I am a singer and a dancer. And so all of those pieces, I went to an HBCU. I work for a nonprofit. All of those aspects of who I am that make me who I am create a complex and multiple layered identity that really cannot be separated. I am constantly operating in the fact that I'm a mom and a math educator and a student and a wife. You know, sometimes you can put it on the back burner, but you are who you are all the time. And so there might be some that are more to the forefront, but there's no way for me to separate being Black and a woman. And as a teacher, both of those are going to be enacted at the same time most of the time because of my experiences. Those experiences are what cause some of these mismatches between students and teachers and can lead to very, well, as it says, an increased risk for negative and inappropriate schooling experiences for CLD, means culturally and linguistically diverse learners. And again, so what we see is teachers who are Black women or Black men who are not bilingual in any way and cannot serve students who are Vietnamese or recently immigrating from Mexico or from India because of a capacity for language, but there's also culture. But if we are culturally responsive educators, we will have the capacity to build relationships with those students regardless of what would be perceived as barriers before. Because otherwise, what tends to happen, especially in between Black children and Hispanic Latino children, it leads to disproportionate amounts of disciplinary actions against students of color and placement in special education, referral to special ed. And that's where a lot of the work that Gloria Ladson-Billings and Geneva Gay did were about brown and Black children in relationship to white children. And because the majority of our teaching population is white, there is sometimes systemic inputs like school discipline practices and that lead to these disproportional relationships or placements in alternative school, or when you see kindergartners being suspended, those kind of actions being taken, research says, can be traced back to implicit bias, which means we have to build cultural competence. And so we have to be aware of our own implicit biases. And everyone has them, and that's something that's difficult to talk about for some people. But we all are wired from birth to begin, well, we're not wired at birth. We begin being wired after birth with particular preferences. And they're not all racially or culturally based. I have a preference for dogs over cats. Not that I want any pets. I have 3 children and a husband. But we have a predication, a predilection for particular things. If I asked you right now, would you rather go to the beach, go to the city, or go to the mountains? Some of you are going to have a very strong response to that. And that's because you were, however you were raised, or it's just where you want to be, but you have a bias towards or against one or two of those places. So bias is something that is usually very subconscious, and it's when it is enacted and is harmful to a student that it becomes a problem. And I have a couple slides about that later on as well, but I just want to make sure some of this is uncomfortable for some people to talk about because we want to think that we are colorblind. But if you say that you're colorblind, then you're not seeing the richness of the diversity of our students. And so it's very important for us as if you are building cultural competence and want to be culturally responsive, then you first have to be aware of your own experiences, because we carry that with us into the classroom, into the law room, into court, into the district office, into family meetings. And so teachers' expectations have a lot to do with how students perform. And I always say students will rise or fall to the expectations that we set for them. Mm-hmm. If I don't expect a child to do well, and all my interactions with that child demonstrate that feeling, that child is probably not going to do well. Now, some have that grit, tenacity, and resistant personality that they're going to do it just to prove me wrong. But a lot of our students are so beat down by our low expectations of them that they just give up and they don't try, and a lot of them will drop out. Diverse and disadvantaged students, marginalized children, children who have the greatest need teachers of their situation, or inclusive again of their situation. So students who have teachers who expect them to do well normally perform better. And in the same vein, if they are not expected to do much, then they usually do not produce much. And so that brings us to our next question. Actually, that's not the one I want. Well, I guess that is the one I want. Oh, I think I'm out of order. So no need to, I'm out of order. My apologies. Right now, we are currently, let me go back to the first survey question. Right now, we are approximately at 51% minority students in public school, and we are at about 83% for teachers that are white. And so when we talk about those, I'm going to go back a little bit. When we talk about implicit bias and the need for cultural competency among the teaching force, it is because from the state level down to the classroom level, we are enacting and creating policies that can in themselves be. And so I have a few examples of what that looks like from a systemic or institutional stance that are very explicit, which means outright explicitly biased versus implicitly biased and at the institution level or individual level. So in the first column, we have institutional bias that is explicit in nature. For example, policies that explicitly discriminate a particular group, like a school refusing to allow Native Americans to enroll. There are still issues in the country, especially in northern states and out west even, where Native American students are being kept from enrolling in schools. There are districts across the country that are actively segregating their school districts by the ways and means in which it's still considered legal at the moment, but that's very explicit. A show of explicit discrimination, discriminatory practices in education. And it's outright, and people will, call them on it, but it becomes a battle. Like fair funding, it becomes a battle. But it's explicit when you are basically disproportionately allotting resources to districts and using zones or school zones or realty to justify having, on one hand, a student spending ratio or student spending amount per year of, say, 7,500 students in one area, and in the same county you have another school who is only receiving about $2,100 per student per year. And so that's something that can be targeted as an explicit act of discriminatory practice in education, whereas institutionally, again, but an implicit is policies that negatively impact one particular group unintentionally. It's implicit. Someone put it in the student code of conduct and didn't realize how it might have negative effects. So the example is vague school discipline policies for discretionary offenses. One thing that I see a lot in the school districts that I work with when they're trying to revamp their student code of conduct and student discipline plan is they may say something like intentional disrespect. The student displayed intentional disrespect. And when you ask them to describe what that looks like, it's very difficult. And in some cases, I'm not, can't make this up. Well, she rolled her eyes at me. So, and I asked them to kind of demonstrate, and so someone will tell me, well, I told her that she couldn't go to the restroom, and she did this. And so that child was suspended for 2 days. That's actually happened. So that is something that, because it's so set in stone in a school discipline plan, that they have, or noncompliance is another one. And so that definitely negatively affects students. And you find that you have students that are repeatedly getting written up or sent home, or even expelled in some cases as young as kindergarten. So what we ask students, school districts, to do is talk to students, parents, teachers, the counselors and administrators, and find a tiered intervention strategy. So even, in America right now, I have a teenager, and when people say, well, there's no cussing on campus, and so I have to push back a little bit and say, okay, do the teachers not cuss either, or cell phone use policies? But it cannot always be all or none. So that implicitly, in some cases, like right now in the news, there are a lot of students who are being, especially black girls, are being given disciplinary action because of their hair being in braids or cornrows. And, it's not necessarily in the student code of conduct, but because it'll say no, non-traditional hairstyles. Well, non-traditional for who? And so when you have policies like that in place, it can negatively affect the learning environment for particular populations of students. And so we ask them to review that and step back from it and think of it from a multicultural, culturally responsive perspective, and help them find ways to rewrite those codes so that they can be inclusive of students rather than exclusive. When you talk about individually exhibiting explicit biases, it's prejudice in action, outright discrimination. So a teacher criticizing someone who is not Christian. So we're about to enter the holiday season, and you might have your, say, well, no, I'm going to say Merry Christmas because I keep the Christ in Christmas. Well, not all of your students might share the same faith as you, and if that comes up in a conversation in the classroom, which is, wholly inappropriate because it's a classroom setting, that's a very explicit, almost invalidation of anything other than your own religious beliefs. So that is not culturally responsive. But even on an implicit level, unconscious, again, attitudes and beliefs that a lot of teachers enact are, so like in math, a lot of math teachers will only call on white and or male students to answer difficult questions. Again, that goes back to higher expectations that they don't feel that their girls might be able to answer, or if there are only a handful of minority children in the room, that they internally might feel like they're giving them a pass, but they may be able to answer the question. So it speaks to effective instruction and valuing all students and having high expectations for all of our students to be able to answer certain questions. If we have had effective teaching, there should be effective learning, and we have to hold our students accountable to that. And so what happens is we see implicit bias has a spiral. At the top, it begins with negative symbolic attitudes, and that can be about race, it can be about gender, it can be about sexual orientation, it can be about religion or income. Students from families with, I like to say, limited financial resources because students don't have jobs, but students with that have low SES or marked as free and reduced lunch, we have this negative stigma. There's a stigma about them, and so we develop these attitudes towards them that become stereotypical. It creates bias. It creates profiling of them, which then can lead to discrimination. Well, I don't want that student in my AP honors course because they're just going to fail or they're going to slow everyone else down without giving them a chance. Well, enough of that happening creates injustice and inequality, and it's just a cycle. And if you look on this graphic, excuse me, for implicit racial bias, you could change racial bias to gender bias, religious bias, sexual orientation bias, income bias, which side of the tracks you were raised on bias, the kind of car you drive bias. When those negative attitudes continue to build, it becomes a bias, which then leads to prejudice and stereotypical attitudes about someone. Everybody who fits that description must be that particular way or is going to demonstrate those particular qualities. And so then we begin to separate them and discriminate against them, which then leads to inequalities because that's when you start getting segregated populations. It can be in the classroom, it can be on the playground, it could be on who's on the PTA and who is not. From the state level, there has to be a systemic approach to being sure that we are going to be providing equitable education for every single child. And so this cycle of biasness and inequality can only be stopped if we become more aware of those biases that we have, that we hold. And I always say that everyone holds particular preferences and biases. Not everyone holds racial biases, or maybe not biases, but prejudice, because that's where that swing starts going way the other way on that third column. I mean, the third out of students in the teenage years and early 20s crying racism for every act that they see, every injustice that they see. And I'm like, but sometimes it's really discrimination or prejudice because of the definition of racism having to do with power and oppression. But it needs to be understood, though, that one, we all carry implicit bias of some sort. Our experiences create in us preferences for certain things and against other things. And those, if we are aware of them, then when we hear ourselves say something, or a coworker say something, or a parent say something, that's when we can say, oh, wait, we can't do that. We have to let that child or that parent or that teacher, demonstrate their own personality or their own engagement in this school, and we cannot prejudge them. And that's, if we can cut that off, being aware of it, calling it for what it is, and addressing it, then hopefully over time, we can reduce the amount of implicit bias that we have against each other and against students and against the parents and the policymakers. In some rooms, if you say politician, that can get a really bad response. And so it's just important for us to understand that we all have these visceral reactions in many ways on a daily basis. And it's not always racial, but we have them. If you have a favorite color, you have a bias. So, and I don't mean to minimize bias, but I need everyone to understand when I say bias, that's such a range of the level of biases that we have. But cultural biases are what lead to racial prejudice, stereotyping, discrimination, and inequality and injustice. And it's important to understand that that cycle. And so again, the implications for policy and practice from looking at the state ESSA plans and the state education agency level, moving down towards assisting regional and local local education agencies. The ESSA specifically points out addressing discriminatory practices that occur with these student populations that are very diverse. And unfortunately, there are more students of diverse backgrounds in relationship to I'll say minority children. There's higher minority children than there are non-minority children, but the teachers that are working with them are not. And so it is important for us to address these cultural issues at a higher level and then from the on the ground in the classroom with the kids everyday level. And so looking at the different aspects of the ESSA plan and where we might be able to see these transformative changes through the relevant pedagogy. And one thing that my director mentioned, he said context matters. When we're talking about student diversity, on the right-hand side of the screen are the 4 protected classes under the Equity Assistance Centers: gender, national origin, race, and religion. So student diversity, almost all of it will fall within one of those circles. On the left-hand side, just a few examples of the disproportional outcomes that occur are like student discipline. Black and Latino boys, and then I would say, well, not I would say, but Black and Latino boys followed by Black girls have the highest instances of school disciplinary actions against them. Even though Black children Blacks in America are at about 13%. In the school system, you have one of the smallest populations getting the majority of the disciplinary actions against them. And so that's disproportional outcomes. And so that's something that has to be looked at. Something I didn't put here is placement in honors and AP courses. If you have a district that has maybe 50% white, 50% minority, you would think that your honors programs would reflect that population. But again, you end up with a very disproportionate outcome sometimes. And not all the time, but a lot of times. And so that's very troubling. You have a higher placement in special education for Black boys and Latino boys. When you talk about religion or national origin and race, then bullying and harassment can become an issue. Bullying and harassment for all 4 areas of student diversity, it can look very different because now, we have students in San Antonio. We had a young man take his own life because of being bullied. And these are just things that, are very disheartening as an educator. And which is why we have to be more culturally responsive and build these cultural climates and school cultures where children are safe and then feel like support from the school. Retention, attrition, low graduation rates, all of those become very disproportionate in the context of student diversity, specifically to race and national origin. English learner populations are having the same issues because of retention, special education placement, student disciplinary actions. And so in the context of these diverse student backgrounds, that's why the achievement gap has not gotten better. That's, the income gap has gotten worse, the achievement gap has gotten worse, and a lot of this comes down to context. So it's very important for us as educators to address this notion of teaching all students and really taking that to task. I'm missing my last slide, but that's where that question came in. It's fine. It's fine. Because I don't want us to run out of time. So in these next few slides, we're talking about learning relationships. Learning is cognitive and social. On the cognitive side, we do have the academic aspect of learning, where it's the content and the skills development that students need to build on as they are matriculating upwards from early childhood on to high school and sometimes off to college and then career. But a large part of what education cultivates in students is their social activity and interactions and behavior. So the school climate, the supports and resources they have, and the interpersonal nature of learning in a culturally responsive environment help balance the cognitive with the social emotional aspect of a student personality. And it definitely impacts their academic achievement. So it's important for us to remember that, you know, a lot of students at this point they don't run out the door to go to school. We have to build those climates and school learning environments where they want to come. And then while they're there, they have to at the same time be but nurtured, you know, socially, interpersonally, and emotionally. Because we're talking about whole child instruction. It's not just about knowing their ABCs and being able to write a wonderful essay. Do they feel positive about the work that they are putting out, and do they feel that they are successful in that in their ventures that they're taking? Will they take chances and risks in the classroom? Are they working with others? You know, the 21st century learning skills talk about collaboration, communication, and when we talk, students need to. We are preparing them for we're preparing them for life. And if we only focus on content and not interpersonal relationships, unless they're going to own their own business, they don't know how to interact with others. And if they're not finding themselves in very diverse learning environments while they're in K-12, then when they go on to college or they go on to the workforce, they don't know how to work with people that don't look like them. And that goes every way. Black students who grow up only surrounded by other Black to interact with students that are Hispanic or Asian or white or Native American, or, you know, if it's something that we all need as human beings, and so we all have to build cultural competence. And in that vein, the school setting is one of the first places where we have to, in recognizing the differences that we have, but embracing that and owning that and making everyone, you know, be able to feel positive about themselves in the learning environment. Strategies and practices and approaches from a systemic viewpoint. When we talk about system design, the strategies include, at the very highest level, setting high expectations, building towards situated learning, which could be problem-based learning, real-world examples, context-based problem solving and sharing, active and authentic engagement of students, working together, working in collaborative grouping, critical thinking. It cannot be rote memorization. It cannot be what they call the banking model. We just feed it to them and they'll learn it. It has to be interactive. Our students have to collaborate at much higher rates and negotiate those understandings and so however that begins when it begins at the state level, the SCA level building down, when we talk about standards and practices, we have to also make sure that we're incorporating problem-based learning, that we're looking at when are students going to have an opportunity to interact with each other, to negotiate that space, to find means and ways to solve problems that might not be the traditional route, because that's what we want. We want to produce critical citizens. We want them to be able to live life after high school, whether that means college or career. But they need to be able to think for themselves. They need to be able to communicate. And so it's really important that we offer as many opportunities in pre-K-12 education that we can for them to build that capacity. In our systems design, the practices, again, would be collaboration at all levels. When we talk about, and I know I live in Texas, and in Texas we have opportunities, which I'm sure other states do, for practitioners to, you know, give feedback on particular assessments or objectives and student learning goals. But it's a collaborative effort between all the levels of stakeholders and to provide feedback. And in the actual classroom, when we talk about this culturally responsive pedagogy for instruction, it sometimes requires demonstration on the part of a, well, I was an academic coach, but whatever that title would be, that state or district level of support, teachers need to see it in action. Professional development is an important part of this as well, but modeling and demonstration, co-teaching, observations, finding ways to provide educators with a variety of opportunities to see these pedagogies in action. And also scaffolding, not just for the students, but for the teachers. We say every time I would do professional development, I would feel like I would have all these things and I want to put them all into place. But I realized that it's important for me as an educator, as well as my students, to do one, try to implement one thing at a time. And over time, you build that efficacy and you can build something else in and you build another. So we have to scaffold our own capacity for instruction as much as we are scaffolding the learner's instruction. Because it's an important piece of, you could try to do everything at one time, but if you're not sure which part is most effective or which part is the most critical for you, because you may, it's very difficult to roll out, because I hate buy-in, I don't use the word buy-in or the term buy-in, I talk about ownership. The teachers need to own that and really internalize it as they are building these practices of culture responsive instruction. And I see a question. I can actually post this PDF, not PDF. I can post the PowerPoint in the slides. It doesn't have to be a PDF unless you just want a PDF, but I can actually send, and I'll talk to Michelle about that, but I can send you the actual presentation if you want to use it. It's free of charge. That's what the EAC does. And that's because I've seen that a couple times. And so when we talk about getting from point A to point B, the actual approaches that we can take as educators to implement and initiate culture responsive teaching practices. One of them is student-centered instruction. The student has to be at the heart of how we design our curriculum models, our material models, our instructional models. It has to include problem solving. We have to provide an environment where students can get stuck. I don't know how else to say that. Especially as a math teacher, that I know that my students are going to learn better when they are challenged and cannot answer my question right away. I don't want them to be able to answer the question right away. I want them to think about the why behind it. I want them to take it to heart of what it is I'm trying to do. I saw a wonderful demonstration in an English class that was reading about the bourgeoisie, and the students were actually role playing, and they had to think about, why would I be worried right now? And that's something, it was just amazing to watch it, but that was student-centered. They were driving the instruction. They were driving the conversation. They were trying to solve problems. How could I get out of this? What could we do? How could we make everyone happy? I mean, it was amazing to see that. But that definitely takes into account how the student is going to respond. And I mean, we know that we have this list of of objectives that we have to get through during the course of a day, of a week, of a year. But sometimes we don't always take into consideration how the students are going to respond. And that's something that is a challenge. But I believe that that next piece, the curriculum materials and assessment pieces that we use, can be very strategically and effectively developed to drive that conversation over time based on the student's reaction. It's something, again, another slippery slope. I used to be a curriculum specialist for Algebra 1, and believe me, I know it's not easy to design instructional materials. However, and I would not offend anyone. I would dare not offend anyone and say think like a kid, but it's more like get the kids feedback. it should be transparent. I am not the keeper of the keys. I heard today someone said we should not be the gatekeepers, we should be the gateways. And that's exactly what a culturally responsive ideology would possess. This last piece before we start closing is leveraging the Every Student Succeeds Act through a culturally responsive pedagogy or pedagogical lens. And this particular image talks about the old school model of instruction and education bridging to a 21st century model, where we used to be very, again, rote memorization and thinking to now where we want deeper learning, higher order thinking, critical thinking, problem solving. And the way to get from one point to the other are through these 4 focus points. The first being a high quality curriculum and assessment, or systems of curriculum and assessment. Again, that takes conversations from a variety of stakeholders, but it's not enough. Like, I have nothing against the Common Core. I live in Texas. We didn't use the Common Core. However, the main critique I had about the Common Core is that I did not feel like they provided enough professional development surrounding implementation of the Common Core. Especially in the math section, it's not that I felt that math was it was too difficult or too challenging or off the mark. I just felt that the teachers did not receive enough training to build the capacity to be able to implement it with fidelity. And so when we think about how we are going to reform curriculum efforts, we have to take that into consideration. A second piece is multiple measures of success. This particular graphic is a screenshot, and it'll be in the comments in my slides, but there's a toolkit. This is called Dash to Win or something like, I can't remember the name, but it actually shows multiple ways of assessing success in a district. It looks at the school demographics, it looks at student performance, attendance and suspensions, on-time graduations, who's participating in advanced or standardized high-stakes testing, AP and SAT. I believe also on here you can look at multiple years. You can look at, there's still multiple. How many English learners do they have? So not just saying, well, all my kids passed the state assessment, we're great. Well, obviously there's much more that has to be looked at, but this is what it means by multiple measures of success. And so state level efforts can be put in place to help districts identify the most promising measures to look at in determining the level of success that a school is making, the level of growth that a school and school district are making in terms of achieving this culturally responsive pedagogy in their schools for schools. Equitable resources are still something that I think across America we struggle with. This particular infographic online, and it's from the New York Times, if I'm not mistaken, and it was just showing a comparison of one of the highest per student spending states and one of the lowest. And when you look at the differences here, funding per student per year in Salem, Massachusetts, $16,721 per student per year, compared to in Salem, Oregon, $10,321. You can already see the 4-year graduation rate starts going down. Operations and maintenance spending goes down. That's, again, infrastructure. But that class size is the one that really, and the student-to-teacher ratio. But imagine what you could do with 16 students in a classroom versus 25, and even 25 is low. You have teachers with 40 kids in their class, and then you challenge their ability to be effective. And so, again, that's a systemic driver that can be addressed to help provide opportunities for teachers to be as effective as they can. And I know that school level, or school, not school, state level organizations are working towards that, but this is the result. When you really look at the outputs, it's very troubling. And so going back to how we measure our growth and our success, we want to implement evidence-based strategies, research-based strategies. They call them EBTs, evidence-based techniques and strategies, and some that I work with on a regular basis that we couch in our research-based practices: sheltered instruction practices, project-based learning, culturally responsive pedagogy, ECE programs to engage students who are marginalized, underrepresented, minority children, students of low-income families. They have a better chance at later school success. That's research says the benefits of early childhood education is just ridiculous for the input. The output is so great, and differentiated instruction. But strategies like this as a front line of defense or implementation to build student success, building teacher capacity around these areas creates learning environments that can become culturally responsive, have higher expectations, value students, incorporate their learning styles, any linguistic needs that need to be addressed, and all for the sake of these equitable educational opportunities that we want to provide to students. And so the challenge to do that, to ensure the academic achievement of our CDLs across the United States, all stakeholders, SEAs and LEAs, must provide this rigorous continuum of ongoing professional development to support in-service, pre-service teachers and all the other stakeholders that are involved in their understanding and implementation of these culturally responsive teaching practices. I'm going to now hand it over to Miss Rosie. Are you on, Rosie?
Yeah, I'm there. I don't know
Okay.
if I am. If
You are. I can hear you. I
Okay.
can hear you.
Okay, well, I really want to thank you because this was a great conversation, a great presentation, an eye-opener to many. And I think that this is just the beginning, the tip of the iceberg, just because we want to get more in depth and more information about this. We want to have your feedback and comments about this webinar. And if you can please click on the link below to complete a survey. We also want to share that this webinar is recorded and Michelle is already putting the link where you can access this webinar. Paula has also offered to send you the PowerPoint in case you are interested in using it. And of course, we want to continue the conversation. In the next slide, and I hope that you can see that the equity assistance centers have a lot of means to continue this conversation with the community of practice, where you can discuss and take action in how to explain this important issue in our public schools. So you can click on that link and then just share those interests that you have with others and receive more information about it. So it is only the last minutes. Thank you very much again. Please remember that we have a second webinar, as Paula mentioned. This was from the top to the bottom, and the next one will be from the bottom to the top, just focusing on how the teachers can really get prepared to promote these culturally responsive practices in every school. Don't forget, please register because the information for the link will be sent to you through the emails that you input when you register in this link. Again, thank you very much. If there are questions, I'm sorry that we didn't have enough time for questions, but if you have more questions, please contact me or contact Paula, and we will be very glad to answer those questions. This is my information. I am the team leader for this initiative, and I will be very glad we're in constant connection with Paula and our other Equity Assistance Center that will be presenting the second webinar. And again, thank you very much for your attendance, your participation, and your interest in this important issue. Thank you very much, Paula. I know that we
Thank you,
distracted
Rosie.
the conference and that we just took you up out from this from your conversations over there, but I think that the information that you have shared with us is wonderful, and we really appreciate
Thank
that.
you. Thank you so much, Rosie. Thank
And
you
thank
all
you
for joining us.